Rise, my apprentice.
Hey, what's up guys? It's Star Wars Kingdom here, and this is the full video to what if Vader regenerated his body. You guys showed so much love and support for part 1. I had to get part 2 done as quickly as possible for you guys. So I really hope you enjoyed this. I have it timestamped, so if you want to skip ahead, you can. But if you want to get a refresher for the full story, you could do that as well. Unfortunately, part 2 isn't as animated as part 1, but as you guys continue to show support for this channel, I will invest more into these animations for the what if videos. Until then, I hope you guys really enjoyed the short animated clips I've been putting out throughout the week. I really enjoy making them, and I will continue to make those as we go on. But without further ado, let's get into the story. Anakin Skywalker was the Republic's greatest warrior, a Jedi Knight prophesied to bring balance to the Force. But seduced by the promises of Darth Sidious, he betrayed the Jedi, slaughtering them in their temple and turning against his former master, Obi-Wan Kenobi. Their battle on Mustafar left him broken, his body burned, his limbs severed, his destiny seemingly sealed. Rescued by the Emperor, he was encased in a life-preserving suit, his power restrained by pain and machinery, forever bound to servitude. But what if that was not the end? What if Vader could manipulate the Force to regenerate his lost limbs, to restore himself to the warrior he once was? Vader stood in the dim glow of his meditation chamber, the rhythmic sound of his breathing filling the silence. Each mechanical inhale was a reminder of his weakness, of the fire that had consumed him, of the blade that had severed his limbs, of the master who had left him to die. His body, once powerful, was now confined within the cold embrace of durasteel and servos. Every movement was a struggle, his motion stiff, unnatural, dictated by the limitations of the armor that sustained him. The pain had not faded. It never would. The flames of Mustafar had scarred more than his flesh. They had carved into his very being, burning away the remnants of Anakin Skywalker and leaving only Vader in his place. And yet, within that suffering, he found strength. Each stab of pain, each restriction of his movement, each hiss of his respirator fueled the darkness within him. He clenched his fist, feeling the servos whine under the pressure. Sidious had saved him, but not out of kindness. This suit was a cage, a cruel mockery of the power he once wielded. It was meant to bind him, to keep him subservient. But the Emperor had underestimated him. Vader's rage was endless, his hatred a fire that would never die. He would endure, he would grow stronger, and one day, he would cast aside these chains. Vader sat in the darkness of his chambers, staring at his gloved hand. This was not his hand, it was a machine. Like the rest of him now. His servitude to Palpatine had been for Padme, for the promise of power great enough to save her, but she was gone. Everything he had done, every betrayal, every crime, had led only to loss. And now, he was bound to a master he no longer wished to serve. Yet he could not simply walk away. He knew his limitations, felt them with every step. Palpatine was stronger than him, not because of skill or cunning, but because of raw power. The Emperor had everything, while Vader had lost too much. His greatest limitation was not the suit nor the pain, it was the loss of his limbs. The midichlorians that had once surged through his body had been severed with them. No matter how much he trained, no matter how much he fed on his rage, his potential was capped. He needed to restore himself, not with enhancements, not with upgrades to his armor. He needed his limbs to return, to regrow as they had been, to let the Force flow through him as it once did, but it would not be easy. Palpatine would not allow it. If he learned of Vader's ambition, he would not hesitate to destroy him. The Emperor had chosen this form for his apprentice for a reason. Crippled, dependent, bound by the limitations of his own body. The suit was a leash. If Vader succeeded in regenerating himself, he would no longer be Palpatine's pawn. That alone was enough to make it a death sentence. And even if he could attempt it, there was another problem. The body was not so easily fooled. Cloning a limb, even one genetically identical to his own, would not work. Others had tried, and all had failed. Midichlorians were tied to the Force, and they did not take kindly to artificial replications. Clone tissue was rejected, breaking down over time, decaying under the unnatural strain. Perhaps this was it. Perhaps he was truly trapped in the Emperor's design, his power forever limited by his failures, his destiny no longer his own, or perhaps there was another way. The steady rhythm of his respirator filled the silence as Vader stood motionless, deep in thought. Not long ago, mere weeks before his downfall, Palpatine had told him a story, one meant to seduce him, to make him embrace the dark side. A story of a Sith Lord who had unlocked the secrets of life itself, Darth Plagueis the Wise. At the time, Vader had been blinded by desperation, consumed by his need to save Padme. But now, in the solitude of his suffering, the story returned to him with new meaning. Plagueis had sought the ultimate power, not just strength in the Force, not just control over others, but dominion over life and death. He had been close, if not successful. And if he had indeed discovered how to manipulate midichlorians, then that was the key, not just to power, but to freedom. Vader clenched his fist. If he could unlock what Plagueis had, he could regenerate. He could break free of the chains that bound him, regrow his limbs, restore the potential he had lost. No longer would he be trapped in this mechanical prison, forever lesser than the warrior he once was. He would be whole again, and when that day came, he would no longer bow to the Emperor. But first, he needed to learn everything there was to know about Darth Plagueis. The Sith Lord's knowledge had been buried, erased by Sidious to ensure that no one else could follow in his footsteps. But Vader knew there were always traces, hidden remnants left behind in the depths of Sith history, holocrons, ancient texts, whispers of those who had once pursued the same forbidden knowledge. He would find them, he would unravel Plagueis' secrets, and in doing so, he would reclaim what had been stolen from him. The search for Plagueis' knowledge led Vader into the deepest shadows of the galaxy, forgotten tombs, lost records, and the whispers of those who dared study what the Sith had buried. It was in this pursuit that he found Dr. Varnus Kren, a rogue scientist whose obsession with midichlorians had made him an outcast. Kren had once been a respected researcher under the Republic, but his experiments had gone too far. He believed midichlorians were not just force conduits, but the very fabric of life itself, capable of being manipulated like any biological function. His work had bordered on heresy, and when the Jedi caught wind of his research, they had shut him down, but Kren had not stopped. In exile, he had continued his studies, pushing into the same dangerous territory that Darth Plagueis had once explored. Vader sought him out, and when they finally met, Kren was not fearful, but intrigued. The Sith Lord before him was a walking paradox, an apex predator, yet restrained by his own flesh. Kren had studied cases of midichlorian degradation in clone tissue before, but never had he encountered a subject like Vader, someone who had lost a significant portion of his original body, yet still held immense power in the Force. Their alliance was formed out of necessity. Kren had knowledge, data, theories, experiments that had never been tested, but he lacked what Vader possessed, the ability to wield the Force itself, to feel the midichlorians in a way no scientist ever could. If the two worked together, combining knowledge with power, they could succeed where others had failed. For Vader, this was no longer just about knowledge. This was his path to freedom. If he could regenerate, if he could restore his body to what it once was, he would no longer be shackled to Palpatine's will, and with each discovery he and Kren made, that possibility became more real. But the deeper they delved, the more dangerous their work became, for if they could find the key to midichlorian manipulation, then so too could Palpatine. And if he discovered their efforts, there would be no mercy. The first experiments were a brutal reminder of the dangers they faced. Vader, despite his mastery of the Force, was still bound by the limits of his own body. Kren had warned him, tampering with midichlorians at this scale was not just risky, it was playing with forces even Plagueis had barely understood. But Vader was unwilling to wait. If this was the key to his regeneration, then he would push forward no matter the cost. The initial procedure was simple in theory, an attempt to stimulate the remaining midichlorians within his body, forcing them to accelerate cellular regeneration. But theory and reality were two different things. The moment they initiated the process, Vader's body convulsed violently, the Force itself recoiling as if rejecting the unnatural manipulation. The pain was unlike anything he had endured before. Not the burning of Mustafar, not the agony of his reconstruction. This was deeper. His very essence felt as if it were being torn apart, as though something within him was resisting, fighting back. Kren tried to stabilize him, injecting chemical compounds designed to enhance cellular repair, but it only made things worse. Vader collapsed, his body seizing, his mind slipping. His connection to the Force wavered, weakening, flickering, as if the very energy that sustained him was being drained away. If he had been any other being, if he did not possess such an intrinsic bond to the dark side, he would have died then and there. But Vader refused to die. Through sheer will, he clung to the Force, feeding on his rage, his hatred, his pain. He had not come this far only to be undone by failure. He reached into the darkness, pulling himself back from the abyss. It took hours before his body stabilized, before he could even rise to his feet. Kren was shaken. He had seen many failures in his experiments, but nothing like this. He suggested they stop, that the risks were too great, that whatever Plagueis had uncovered was not meant to be tampered with, but Vader would not stop. This failure had only confirmed one thing: the path to regeneration was real. It was possible, and if it could nearly kill him, that only meant he was close to something truly powerful. Kren's network of informants stretched across the underworld, a collection of exiled scientists, black market dealers, and those who sought knowledge forbidden by both the Jedi and the Sith. One such informant had just delivered news that could change everything: a lead on an old facility where Darth Plagueis was rumored to have conducted his most secretive research. Vader listened in silence as Kren relayed the details. The facility was deep in the outer rim, hidden beneath the surface of a barren, forgotten moon. It had been abandoned for decades, its existence erased from most records. But if the rumors were true, this was where Plagueis had spent years experimenting with midichlorians, refining his theories on life, death, and the Force itself. If any place held the key to Vader's regeneration, it was there.
"We must go,"
Vader said, his voice cold and unwavering. Kren hesitated. The facility's location was remote, its condition unknown. There was no telling what traps or defenses might remain, what remnants of Plagueis' work could still lurk in the ruins. But there was no arguing with Vader's determination. If this place held even the smallest fragment of knowledge, it was worth the risk. Preparations were swift. Vader's personal ship, the Scimitar, would take them there under the cover of secrecy. There could be no Imperial involvement, no trail leading back to them. Palpatine could not know. As the ship lifted off, Vader stood in the cockpit, watching as the stars stretched into hyperspace. His mind was fixed on a single thought. This was more than a search for knowledge. This was the next step in his evolution. He was no longer just seeking freedom from the suit. He was seeking something far greater. If Plagueis had truly uncovered the secrets of midichlorian manipulation, then Vader would take that power for himself, and nothing, not Palpatine, not the failures of the past, would stand in his way. The ship descended onto the barren, forgotten moon, its surface covered in the scars of time. The facility stood before them, rusted and worn, yet still intact, an echo of the past, holding secrets that had long been buried. The moment they stepped inside, the air felt thick, heavy with the residue of experiments conducted long ago. Dr. Kren was in pure awe. His eyes darted across the abandoned chambers, scanning the faded inscriptions, the scattered notes left behind by a mind that had nearly conquered death itself. He muttered in excitement, running his fingers over data slates covered in Sith inscriptions. This was it, the culmination of everything he had spent his life searching for. Plagueis had not just studied midichlorians, he had understood them on a level no one else had. If they could decipher his work, regeneration was not just a possibility, it was inevitable. But before they could go deeper, before they could truly unravel what was left of Plagueis' knowledge, the room trembled. The sound of approaching ships, the low hum of engines breaking through the silence. Vader turned sharply. He was here. The doors to the facility hissed open, and the towering figure of Emperor Palpatine stepped forward, flanked by a contingent of crimson-clad royal guards. The scientist's informant had betrayed them, of course. Palpatine had eyes and ears everywhere, especially in the scientific community. The moment Kren had begun his work with Vader, it had only been a matter of time before it reached the Emperor's attention. Palpatine stepped forward slowly, his golden eyes gleaming with curiosity. His voice was smooth, yet laced with underlying menace.
Tell me, Lord Vader, why does my apprentice have such an interest in Darth Plagueis?
Vader remained silent, his breath heavy through the vocoder, but Palpatine already knew. He pieced it together instantly. He had always feared this day would come, the moment Vader would seek to surpass his chains, to reach for power beyond what his master allowed. His amusement quickly turned to contempt.
You seek to defy me. You wish to rid yourself of the gift I have given you. Foolish. There is no life for you outside of my will.
With a wave of his hand, the royal guard seized Dr. Kren. The scientist struggled, but he was no warrior.
The scientist still has some use. He will not be wasted.
And then, without warning, lightning erupted from Palpatine's fingertips. The blue tendril struck Vader, consuming him instantly. The chamber was filled with the deafening crackle of raw power. Vader's body convulsed, falling to his knees as the electricity coursed through him. His suit, designed to both sustain and weaken him, turned against him, intensifying the pain, amplifying every burst of agony. The dark side fed on pain, but this was beyond suffering. This was a reminder of who was in control. Vader writhed, his vision flashing red, his respirator malfunctioning with each jolt. He reached out through the Force, but Palpatine only increased the intensity. He wanted Vader to break. Just as the darkness began to consume him, just as the void of death loomed over him once again, the lightning stopped. Vader collapsed, his body smoldering, his breath ragged. Palpatine loomed over him, his expression unreadable.
Let this be your final warning. If you continue down this path, I will not show mercy next time.
Vader's fists clenched, but he said nothing. He had no choice. With a gesture, Palpatine's guards lifted him to his feet, escorting him out like a broken tool that had failed its purpose. As he was led away, he cast one last glance at the facility, the place that had held his one hope, and then with a final command from the Emperor, the facility was demolished. The walls collapsed, the knowledge of Darth Plagueis erased from existence, buried under rubble, ensuring that the secrets Vader had sought would remain forever beyond his grasp. Vader sat alone in the dim confines of his meditation chamber, his body still recovering from the Emperor's punishment. The pain was nothing new. He had endured far worse, but the failure cut deeper than any wound. His one chance to reclaim his power had been destroyed before his very eyes. Palpatine had made his message clear. Any attempt to defy him would end in suffering. For the first time, doubt began to creep into Vader's mind. Perhaps he had been foolish. Perhaps this path had been nothing more than a fantasy, one that had cost him dearly. He had no leads, no facility, no scientist. His one ally was gone, and with him, the knowledge Vader had fought so hard to obtain. He was back at square one, trapped, caged, broken, but then a spark of hope. Through his remaining network of spies and informants, Vader uncovered one final lead, the location of Dr. Kren. The scientist had not been executed, nor had he been discarded. Instead, he had been taken to Mount Tantus. The name was legendary among those who dabbled in forbidden sciences. Hidden deep within the jagged peaks of the planet Wayland, Mount Tantus was more than a prison. It was an Imperial black site, a vault where Palpatine hoarded his most classified research. Cloning, genetic experiments, dark side artifacts. If the Emperor had deemed Kren's knowledge useful, then it would be there that he was forced to continue his work. Vader's mind sharpened. His failures did not matter now, only the path forward. If Kren was still alive, then his research still existed. The Emperor had erased Plagueis' records, but he would not so easily erase the mind of a scientist who had spent his life chasing the same forbidden knowledge. Mount Tantus held what he needed. Vader moved like a shadow through the corridors of Mount Tantus. His breathing, once a constant mechanical rhythm, was now silent, manually deactivated and burst as he crept past patrols. The facility was heavily guarded, its halls crawling with Imperial officers, scientists, and troopers, but none of them would live long enough to sound the alarm. Anyone who saw him died before they could report him. A quick flick of his wrist, a crushed throat, a silent lightsaber strike through the back. The Force guided him, making him a phantom in the Emperor's most secret stronghold. He was beyond caring about the consequences. If this mission ended in his death, so be it. He would rather die chasing power than live as Palpatine's crippled puppet. Then, at last, he found Kren. The scientist was not alone. A team of researchers surrounded him, all engrossed in their work. Midichlorians, genetic regeneration, the very studies Palpatine had once deemed too dangerous to share. But what caught Vader's attention most was the look on Kren's face when he saw him. Not fear, excitement. Lord Vader, you made it! Kren gestured to the data terminals, his voice hurried but filled with hope. We've made incredible progress. Plagueis theories, your idea of regeneration, it can work. It will work, but we don't have much time. They didn't. The longer Vader remained, the greater the risk of discovery. But none of that mattered. Kren turned to him, his expression shifting to one of warning. You understand the risk? He asked. If this fails, it will kill you. Vader did not hesitate. The process was brutal. The pain, immeasurable. Vader felt the Force twisting around him, his body fighting against the unnatural acceleration of its own reconstruction. The dark side fed on his agony, fueled the process, binding flesh and energy together. His limbs regrew, his organs restored. The power of the Force intertwined with Kren's research, and where all others had failed, Vader succeeded. As he rose from the operating table, his fists clenched. His power surged through him like never before. His connection to the Force was stronger, his body whole again, but it would take time for his midi-chlorian count to fully return to its former levels. But that did not matter. He had done it. He had broken the chains placed upon him. He was no longer a crippled servant bound to a mechanical prison. He was Darth Vader, reborn. Kren, still breathless from witnessing the impossible, turned to Vader with desperation. "We need to leave. You must take me with you. We can refine this. Take it even further." Vader looked at him, expression unreadable. Kren had served his purpose. The knowledge they uncovered could not be allowed to fall into the Emperor's hands. With a single motion, Vader ignited his lightsaber and drove it through the scientist's chest. Kren's eyes widened in shock as he collapsed, his work dying with him. The rest of the researchers panicked, but before they could react, Vader cut them down one by one. He had no need for witnesses. As alarms blared throughout the facility, Vader strode toward the exit. His work here was finished. The future was his to claim. Anakin flexed his fingers, watching the way his skin stretched over knuckles that hadn't been his in years. Flesh, real, living flesh. He ran a hand over his forearm, feeling the warmth, the pulse of blood beneath the surface. The cybernetics were gone. No more durasteel, no more lifeless machinery acting as a barrier between him and the Force. The change had been gradual but undeniable. At first, the limbs had felt foreign, like borrowed pieces not yet fully his own. Yet as days passed, as muscle strengthened and sensation returned, they became an extension of himself once more, and with them something else awakened. The Force. It no longer whispered from a distance, no longer flickered behind a veil of pain and machinery. It surged within him, rich and full, as though the missing pieces of his soul had been returned along with his body. The midichlorians had regrown within his cells, pulsing with life, reconnecting him to something he had nearly lost. Anakin stood, breathing in deeply. His movements were effortless, no longer weighed down by mechanical hesitation. He lifted a hand, fingers outstretched, and the air around him trembled. The Force responded, eager, unchained, as if it had been waiting for this moment as much as he had. For the first time in years, he was whole, and for the first time in years, he had no idea what that meant. Anakin stood in the shadows of an abandoned structure on the lower levels of Coruscant, his breath slow, measured. He had no armor, no mask, just the tattered remains of a dark tunic and the weight of his own thoughts. The city above thrived under Imperial rule, but down here, in the underbelly, the war never truly ended. He was alone. For years, he had commanded legions. Clones had followed him into battle without hesitation. Jedi had once stood by his side, believing in his strength, his leadership. Now both were gone. One by his hand, the other wiped away by the Empire he helped create. And that was the problem. The Empire would never welcome him back. Darth Vader had been Palpatine's enforcer, but Anakin Skywalker was a traitor to both sides. To the Emperor, he was a failed apprentice, a broken tool. To the remaining Jedi, he was a butcher, a nightmare given form. Any resistance that still lingered would never trust him. It didn't matter. Anakin didn't need their trust. He didn't need allies. He needed revenge. Palpatine had manipulated him from the start, whispering in his ear, turning him against the Jedi, against himself. He had made Anakin believe there was no other path, that power was his only salvation, and worst of all, he had lied about Padme, told him that she had died because of him, that her death was his doing. The anger swelled inside him, raw and unchecked. Palpatine had to die. But how? The Emperor was untouchable, surrounded by the very machine Anakin had helped build. The Imperial palace was guarded by legions. His warships filled the skies, and the Dark Lord himself was far from weak. Anakin had seen his power firsthand. He had felt it in the Senate chamber. The moment Windu had been overpowered. The moment everything had changed. Palpatine was no frail politician. He was a predator. And if Anakin faced him now, without a plan, without a way to close the gap in strength, he would lose. He exhaled sharply, his fists clenching. For the first time in his life, he had no master, no cause, no army to back him. The Jedi were gone. The Republic was dead. The Empire would never accept him. So where did that leave him? The answer was bitter, but undeniable. He was alone. And if he wanted to kill the Emperor, he would have to find his own way to do it. Anakin would to Naboo for clarity. The galaxy had never felt more distant, more hollow. His mind was a storm, a clash of rage and grief with no direction, no purpose. Palpatine had taken everything from him, his future, his past, her, and now, standing on Naboo for the first time since it all fell apart, he sought something he couldn't name. Padme. The journey to her tomb was quiet. The city, the palace, the people, none of it mattered. Only the path ahead, only the weight in his chest as he approached the place where she rested. The tomb was silent, save for the soft echo of Anakin's footsteps as he stepped forward, his presence casting a long shadow against the cold stone, the dim candlelight flickering against the sharp angles of his face. His piercing blue eyes, usually filled with fury or determination, were hollow now, lost in the weight of the past. He reached out, fingertips grazing the carved name before him, Padme Amidala Naberi. His breath shook.
"I don't deserve to be here,"
he murmured, his voice barely more than a whisper.
"I don't deserve your forgiveness."
His fingers curled into a fist against the stone, the familiar rage threatening to surface, but he let it pass. This moment wasn't about anger. It wasn't about vengeance. It was about her.
"You believed in me. Even at the end, you still saw something good in me."
His voice wavered, the weight of his sins pressing down like an unbearable force.
"But I let you down. I let you die."
The words tasted bitter in his mouth.
"I thought I was saving you. I thought I was strong enough to defy fate. But all I did was become the thing you fought against."
The silence of the tomb stretched, suffocating.
"I would give anything, to take it back."
His jaw tightened, his breath unsteady.
"But I can't, and I know I'll never be worthy of the forgiveness I'm asking for."
He clenched his fist at his sides.
But I needed to say it anyway.
Somewhere in the darkness, something shifted. Anakin tensed. It was faint, too faint for most to notice, but he wasn't most. A presence lingered just beyond the candlelight, watching, listening. The force prickled at his senses, the feeling of being observed sinking into his bones. He turned sharply, scanning the shadows.
"Who's there?"
Silence, and then a step. A soft movement against stone. A figure emerged from the darkness. For a split second, Anakin's breath caught in his throat. The way the candlelight framed her face, the shape of her features, the dark eyes locked onto his.
"Padme?"
The name left his lips before he could stop it. The figure hesitated, her body still as stone. Then, after a long moment, she spoke.
"No,"
she said evenly.
"I am not her."
The illusion shattered. Anakin's expression darkened, the flicker of hope in his blue eyes extinguishing as reality set in. She looked like Padme, but she wasn't her. She never could be.
"Who are you?"
His voice was quiet, but there was no mistaking the tension in his stance. The woman took another step forward, her gaze never leaving his.
"My name is Sabe."
Recognition sparked in his mind. He had known of Padme's handmaidens, the shadows who protected her, but he had never paid them much thought. Now, standing before him, one of those shadows had returned, not to protect, but to confront.
"I thought you were dead. I thought you died protecting her."
Anakin's jaw tightened.
"I should have."
Sabe studied him carefully, her expression unreadable.
"I know the truth. I know what you became. And yet, I heard what you just said."
Anakin didn't reply. He simply watched her, waiting.
"If you truly regret what you did, if you still care about her, then you should know that her dream isn't dead."
His brow furrowed slightly.
"There are people fighting for what she believed in. A growing resistance against the Empire. They don't trust you, they hate you. But your skill, your knowledge, it could help them."
She let the weight of her words settle before adding,
"You can help her dream live on, even after death."
For a long moment, Anakin said nothing. His blue eyes flickered with something unreadable, anger, sorrow, purpose, before he finally turned back to Padme's tomb.
"She believed in me,"
he said softly. He exhaled slowly, then turned to Sabe once more.
"Tell me more about this rebellion."
For a moment, Sabe hesitated. Despite everything, despite what he had done, despite what the galaxy knew him as, there was something in his voice, not desperation, not manipulation, something real. She gave a slow nod.
"I will."
But even as she spoke the words, doubt gnawed at her. Could she truly trust him? Would he betray them the moment he got too close? Or had Padme been right? Later, in the quiet of her chamber, Sabe sat in the dim glow of a flickering holo, her jaw tight as she watched the recording again. She had seen it a dozen times already, but it never got easier. Padme lay weak, barely clinging to life, her voice soft yet unwavering.
Obi-Wan, Vader is still getting him. There is still.
The words haunted her. The Senate was gone. The Jedi were gone. The Republic had been swallowed whole by the Empire, and Anakin Skywalker, no, Darth Vader, had helped make it happen. The others, Bail, Mon Mothma, the few who still resisted, had no doubt Anakin was lost, a murderer, a traitor, but Padme had believed in him, and Sabe had believed in her. She shut off the recording, exhaling slowly. The others would never trust him, never even consider the possibility that he could be anything but an enemy. But Padme's dying words refused to let her accept that. If there was even the smallest chance that Anakin Skywalker still existed beneath the monster the galaxy feared, she had to find out, even if it meant going alone. Anakin knew the truth wouldn't be enough. Trust wasn't something he could demand. He had spent too many years destroying it. But if he wanted a chance to strike at Palpatine, to bring down the Empire, he needed allies. And the only ones willing to fight the Emperor were the same people who had every reason to kill him. The rebellion was small, scattered, barely more than whispers in the dark. But he knew they existed. More importantly, he knew what they didn't: the Death Star. The Emperor's ultimate weapon was still in its infancy, years away from completion, but its existence was a threat greater than any fleet or army. If the rebels had any hope of stopping the Empire, they needed to know what was coming. Getting a message to them was nearly impossible. He wasn't a Jedi anymore, but he could still sense when he was being watched. No matter where he went, Imperial spies were everywhere. But there were cracks in the Empire's hold, places where whispers still traveled. It was through these channels that his warning reached them. They didn't trust him. Of course they didn't, but they listened. A scout was sent. One ship, cloaked and cautious, slipping through the void to the coordinates Anakin provided. When it returned, the message was clear. He hadn't lied. The construction site was real. The Death Star was real. For the first time, the rebels had a reason to act. For the first time, they had a reason to consider that Anakin Skywalker wasn't the enemy they thought he was. But trust? That was still a long way off. The scout's report left the rebel leader shaken. The Death Star was real. Bail Organa knew what had to be done. If the Empire was truly building a weapon of this magnitude, it couldn't remain in the shadows. It had to be exposed. But the rebellion was still in its infancy, fragile, lacking the strength to act alone. This was bigger than their fight. It was bigger than Anakin Skywalker. It was a matter for the Senate. And so, Bail took the fight to the heart of the Empire itself. The Senate chamber buzzed with murmurs as Bail Organa took the floor, his voice carrying across the vast hall with practiced authority.
We were promised peace.
His words were careful, deliberate.
The Clone Wars have ended. The Republic, no, the Empire, stands unchallenged. And yet, we have received troubling reports of a secret military project of unimaginable scale. One that has never been presented for Senate approval. A weapon, the likes of which the galaxy has never seen. A battle station capable of destroying entire worlds.
A ripple of uneasy whispers spread through the Senate pods. Bail let the weight of his words settle before continuing.
I ask you, Chancellor. No, Emperor Palpatine. Why does an empire at peace need a superweapon? Why is such a thing being built in the shadows, without the consent of this governing body?
The air in the chamber tensed. All eyes turned to the central podium as Palpatine slowly rose. The silence stretched, a moment of pure control. And then his voice, smooth as silk, reached every corner of the room.
Senator Organa,
he began, his tone carrying a warmth that made his presence feel more fatherly than dictatorial.
your concerns, while admirable, stem from fear, and fear, as we have seen time and time again, leads to chaos.
He turned his gaze across the chamber, making sure every senator felt his words.
Let us consider history, my friends. The Clone Wars raged for years, leaving the galaxy fractured, weak. How many of us lost loved ones? How many of our worlds burned while we pleaded for peace? And who truly benefited from that war?
He paused. The senators were listening.
The Jedi. They were warriors, not peacekeepers. They allowed the war to spread, claiming to fight for democracy while secretly maneuvering to seize control for themselves.
Scattered murmurs of agreement rose. The Jedi had fallen, but their legacy was still debated. Palpatine had long since poisoned their image, turning them into a specter of instability.
Now,
He said, his voice shifting into one of gentle authority.
we have peace. But peace is fragile. We cannot be naive. Already remnants of disorder lurk in the shadows, seeking to undermine our new order. These so-called rebels wish to restore the chaos of the past.
He clasped his hands in front of him, his face etched with a careful mix of sorrow and resolve.
I do not seek war. My friends, I seek security. We seek security.
A murmur of agreement spread through the chamber.
This station is not a weapon of war. It is a shield, a deterrent, a symbol that the Empire will not fall as the Republic did, fractured by those who conspire in darkness.
He let his words hang before delivering the final blow.
Or would the Senate prefer we leave ourselves defenseless? Would you rather see another war consume us?
A hushed silence fell over the room. No senator would dare advocate for weakness. No one wanted another war. Bail clenched his jaw. He could see it happening. The shift, the doubt. Palpatine had won them over. Slowly, the Chancellor-turned-Emperor gave a small nod, as if saddened by the necessity of his actions.
I understand your concern, Senator Organa, and so, in the spirit of transparency, I welcome an official Imperial Senate review of this project's necessity. But I assure you all, this station will not be used to bring war. It will prevent one.
A smattering of applause broke the silence. Palpatine smiled. The Senate was his. Palpatine had won the Senate, but Bail Organa had no intention of letting the matter rest. The Death Star was more than a weapon. It was a warning, a promise that the Empire's grip would soon be unbreakable. If they allowed its completion, resistance would become impossible. Fear would replace hope. The galaxy would be Palpatine's forever. War was inevitable. Bail and the few senators who dared to oppose the Emperor worked in secret, gathering what resources they could. The rebellion wasn't ready for an all-out war, but this mission wasn't about fighting the Empire. It was about stopping the Death Star before it could ever be used. Ships were acquired in hushed deals, funds funneled through hidden channels. They had no formal fleet, only a patchwork of outdated starfighters, civilian vessels, and a handful of Republic-era warships stripped of their insignias. It wasn't enough. What they needed most were pilots, the best in the galaxy, and that meant him. Bail hesitated before making the decision. Every instinct told him Anakin Skywalker could not be trusted. He had been a war hero once, but he had also been Darth Vader, the man who helped slaughter the Jedi, the man who led the attack on the Republic's last defenses. But war was about strategy, not trust. And if there was one pilot who could lead this mission, it was Anakin. So Bail sent the message. Anakin's answer came before the request was even fully spoken. I'll do it. No hesitation, no questions. Bail studied him carefully, searching for deception, for any trace of the man who had betrayed everything he once fought for, but all he saw was resolve. You understand what this means? Bail pressed. This won't be a simple attack. Once we move, there's no turning back. The Emperor will hunt us. The rebellion will no longer be whispers and shadows. It will be war. Anakin held his gaze. Then let's start a war. The fleet tore through hyperspace, engines humming with anticipation. Every pilot, every soldier knew the stakes. The Death Star had to be destroyed before it could become fully operational. There would be no second chances. Anakin sat in the cockpit of his starfighter, gripping the controls tightly. This was it, the fight that would define everything. If they succeeded, the rebellion would have a future. If they failed, the Empire's reign would be absolute. The nav computer beeped. Reversion imminent. Then, the star stretched back into place, and they were met with nothing. Anakin's stomach tightened. The Death Star was gone. Instead of a half-built superweapon, the fleet was greeted by empty space. No construction, no orbital defenses, just the eerie quiet of a trap already sprung. Then, hyperspace ripples. Dozens of Venator-class star destroyers ripped into real space around them. emerging from all sides. The trap had been set long before they arrived. "No!" The comm channels erupted with panicked voices. "It's an ambush!" They were waiting for us. "We're surrounded. We can't jump." The first wave of turbo-laser fire tore through the rebel fleet, lighting up the void with emerald streaks of destruction. Starfighters scrambled, weaving through the chaos, but the blockade was too tight. Any attempt to flee would end in collision or vaporization. Anakin gunned his engines, blasting through a squadron of Imperial fighters as they swarmed the field. He fought like a force of nature, cutting through the opposition with precision, but it wasn't enough. There were too many of them. One by one, rebel ships were picked off, their destruction adding to the growing field of debris. Palpatine had planned this, and worse, he was here. Anakin felt him, the dark presence radiating from one of the Venators. The Emperor had come personally to witness the end of the rebellion, to watch them burn. Anger surged through him. He wasn't going to let that happen. Anakin broke from the battle, weaving through the carnage, dodging the relentless crossfire. His fighter dove toward the nearest Venator, its bridge looming above him like a specter of the past. He deactivated his comms. No explanations, no warnings. There was only one way this ended. His ship skidded through the hangar bay, landing hard as alarms blared. Before the troopers even reacted, his lightsaber ignited. He cut through them in a blur of movement, never stopping, never hesitating. His path was set, the engine room. His presence was a storm tearing through the corridors, leaving only silence in his wake. The deeper he went, the louder the ship hummed around him, power surging through its veins. Then, the core chamber. Anakin stretched out a hand. The force swelled within him, raw and unchained. Then he crushed it. The ship screamed. Metal groaned, the structure trembling as the engines ruptured, sending waves of explosions tearing through the hull. The mighty Venator began to falter, its massive frame shuddering, and in that moment, the blockade cracked. Jump, now! The rebel fleet seized the opportunity. One by one, hyperspace streaks ignited across the battlefield. Those who had survived, those who had lived, disappeared into the void. The rebellion would live to fight another day, but Anakin had no intention of leaving. He turned toward the lift leading to the bridge, his steps slow, measured. The dark presence loomed closer. The door slid open, revealing a dimly lit corridor, and at the far end, waiting in the shadows, stood the Emperor. Palpatine's golden eyes gleamed in the flickering emergency lights.
"Foolish, my apprentice.
His voice slithered through the air.
You cannot escape what you are."
Anakin stepped forward, his lightsaber igniting in a brilliant flash.
I'm not trying to escape.
The ship shuddered, explosions rocking its foundation, but neither moved, not yet. Then, like lightning, they struck. Their blades clashed, filling the air with sparks. Palpatine was fast, unnaturally fast, but Anakin was stronger. For the first time, he fought without doubt, without fear, without the weight of the past dragging him down. The corridors blurred around them, the ship collapsing in on itself, but Anakin pressed forward. Palpatine's sneer twisted into something else. Shock. Anakin was winning. The final strike came swift, decisive. His blade cut clean, and the Emperor staggered, a look of disbelief flashing across his face as he fell to his knees. Anakin stood over him, breathing hard.
You took everything from me.
Palpatine opened his mouth to speak. The lightsaber plunged into his chest. The Emperor of the Galactic Empire was dead. The ship gave its final violent lurch. Flames engulfed the walls, the floor splitting apart as the reactor detonated. Anakin didn't move. He had done what he came to do. The force swirled around him, peaceful in a way he hadn't felt in years. The fire took him. The Venator burst apart in a brilliant explosion, its wreckage scattering into the void, and Anakin Skywalker was no more. The galaxy changed the day the Venator fell. With the Emperor dead, the Empire crumbled from within. His grip had been absolute, held together by fear and control. Without him, it fractured. Ambitious Moffs and warlords turned on each other, each vying for power, but none could match Palpatine's mastery. The machine he built was too vast, too dependent on his will. It collapsed under its own weight. The rebellion now became the architects of a new future, one without the Sith, one without the shadow of tyranny. But for those who had known him, The story of Anakin Skywalker was not so simple. Word of his final act spread through the rebellion, whispered between commanders, spoken in hushed tones among those who had once feared his name. He had fought to save them. He had killed the Emperor, destroyed the trap meant to crush the last hope of the galaxy. Padme had been right. There had been good in him. Even after everything, even after Mustafar, Obi-Wan sat in quiet contemplation as the news reached him. He thought Anakin was lost to the darkness. He had convinced himself there was no redemption, that the friend he had loved was gone forever. And yet, in the end, Anakin had proven him wrong. The boy he trained, the man he called brother, had done what no Jedi could. He had ended the Sith, not in search of power, not for revenge, but because, at his core, he was still Anakin Skywalker. Obi-Wan closed his eyes, allowing himself a rare moment of peace. The war was over. The Sith were no more. Anakin was gone, but in the end, he had chosen the light, and that was enough. Years passed. Luke Skywalker stood atop a hill on Yavin 4, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon. The Jedi Temple behind him was still under construction, but already its foundations were strong. The Jedi had been nearly wiped from existence, but they would not stay buried. He would not let them. The Force swirled around him, vast and endless. He had never known his father, and never seen him beyond the stories of the war, of the darkness he once embraced. But now, in the quiet of twilight, he felt something else, something deeper. Anakin Skywalker had been many things: a hero, a traitor, a destroyer, a savior. But in the end, he had been what Padme believed him to be all along: good. And because of that, the Jedi would rise again. A new era had begun.